So here's what you need. Some plywood, that's more than enough. It's about 14 millimeters, like ½ inch or so. Some 2-component glue, epoxy glue. You need some paracord, not as much as this, just a little bit of it. Then you need 2 wooden rods, about 10 millimeter by 30 millimeter and about 90 centimeters long. Make sure that they are very straight. So the best is to just check a few of them out and take those that are really straight, 2 of them. And we need 1 wooden rod that's about 17 times 40 or 45 millimeters. And that should also be like 90 centimeters or a meter, something like that. Last not least, we're going to need a toothbrush. Ideally a soft one with a straight brush. And of course we need some zero band, in this case about 45 centimeters of it. Zero band gold works best. So take the arrow that you want to use and put it in so that there is about 1 inch of the shaft protruding from the top. Now mark the length of the arrow shaft and saw the boards off at that point. Now you take a length of flat iron, thickness should be about 4 to 6 millimeters, and put it in between the 2 wooden rods, like this. And this is because later on this will be the guide for the arrow. So now we're using clamps to hold the whole setup together. So now we smear on epoxy and glue the thing on. Now we use some more clamps and put the whole thing firmly on the base plate, on the base bar. Make sure that the end is flush. And make sure that the whole thing is pretty much centered. So once the glue has set, simply remove the flat iron from its setup. And now you have your arrow guide. Very nice. Next we saw out the string stopper, and you actually have to do a second one, probably of thinner multiplex, for the optics for a red dot sight later on. So next, fine-tune the dimension of the string stopper until it fits nicely over the barrel, and then also make sure that the arrow fletching can pass without touching anything. Now drill 3 holes into the setup in order to mount them onto the frame, and then smear everything with epoxy glue. So you smear on the epoxy glue into a position of about 23 centimeters from the muzzle side, and then you push on the frame and mount it. Now put the second one approximately 13 centimeters or so towards the muzzle. No screws needed for this one, just glue. Next, saw out the fork part. Now drill 2 holes through the front plate and make sure that they're not on one level, so the wood splintering won't be as bad. Now you must pre-drill these holes, otherwise the wood will splinter. So this is how it now should look like. Note that I slimmed down the string catch, just so that later on when the bands will stretch out, they will not get into contact with the string stop. Now we roughen up the back of the head of the toothbrush, and you can do that with a rasp or with a saw. Just make sure it's nice and rough. This will give much better purchase for the glue. Now we saw off the head right here. Now we put the head inside of the string stop. Make sure it's nice and flush. It will protrude slightly on the back side, and it should really put some pressure on the arrow. Not a great deal, just a bit. Smear on the glue and put it in while the arrow is seated, so that the position is perfect. Next, saw out a thin piece of wood and glue it in front of this here, so that the plastic part from the toothbrush head is protected against the string later on. Otherwise it will simply rip the toothbrush head from the construction. This is how it should look like now. So the arrow, when you kind of shift it out of position, should now always snap back into its guide rail. Next, saw out the trigger lock assembly. So now you file in a groove for the arrow, and the arrow must be able to glide through. You also file in a notch for the string and the rubber band later on. Now if you want, you can now add some metal. That is necessary if you want to use very strong rubber bands like I do. So this is how a metal strengthened trigger lock should now look like. Note that I glued a little bit of broken away first surface from the multiplex. Now just round the back end of the arrow guide a little bit so that the trigger fits. And you can see the arrow needs to be pointing straight through the lock. Next, saw out the shoulder stock and lock assembly parts and glue them together. Note that the middle part is exactly the same material as the trigger lock, because it's supposed to move in between here. Saw a slot through the handle part, and again it needs to be absolutely free so that the string can later on just fit through here. So this is how it's supposed to look like when assembled. And then when you shoot, as you see, you release the arrow. Now put in 2 nails, not very tight so that you can remove them. One is for the rubber band that sets the whole thing under tension, and the other one is for the trigger string. Glue on the lock and the stock assembly. So this is now finished. Here is the rubber band. So it would now already shoot. Next we saw out the handle parts 3 times and make sure that the middle layer is a little bit thicker, because we need room for the trigger. So saw out the room for the trigger and glue the 2 parts together. With the 3rd layer we screw it on so that we can service the mechanism later on. Now you mount the handle to the frame, and then you drill a hole for the lanyard for the string. So, and then you attach the string to the trigger so that it runs through here and then goes into the handle and attaches to the trigger. So when you pull the trigger, it pulls on the string and the lock opens automatically. So it's nearing completion. And I've also attached a handle for the left arm. Looks pretty good. Now we'll attach the red dot side. So we cut out a bridge between the 2 string stoppers, and just make sure that they're really centered. They should be in exactly the same direction as the arrow. So I used a very inexpensive Weber rail and a very inexpensive red dot sight. And the only thing is you should mount it in a way that it directly points into the direction of the arrow, because the arrow will fly pretty straight, hopefully. As you see, when you pull the trigger, this notch here is lifted up, and this will later on then release the arrow. And this here is actually a rest for my cheek, so that I can aim through the red dot sight.